I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. We are on our later stretches of season 12. It's been so amazing, and I'm very excited for today's conversation. Today, we're talking to Nancy Kendall. She is the professor and chair of educational policy studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her scholarship examines how national and international education policies, development agendas, and funding regimes shape the lives of children and communities positioned as marginalized. Working across comparative education, gender studies, and global development, she studies the political and economic forces that structure schooling in the United States and across parts of Africa and Latin America. How are you doing today?
So happy to be here with you.
I know. We were just talking about Super Bowl, and I just wanted to touch back on that because I feel like it's watching the ads was such an interesting experience, and I feel like I'll be able to tie it to our conversation. But what does it feel like for you when I just feel like I consumed a sludge of just like buy stuff, buy things, you're not enough, you need more things in your life. And I just thinking about how I feel after the weekend, I just feel kind of gross.
Uh, I think a lot about watching my kids watch TV now. Uh, there's a lot of ways in which you can watch TV now, movies now, where you really don't have as many advertisements as I grew up with. Like when I was watching TV when I was young, you couldn't fast forward through things, you couldn't watch things later, you watched things when they were on, and you watched the ads that were on. And the ads, if I remember them correctly, were mostly toys and cereal, things like that. And watching the ads in the Super Bowl, I thought how we have changed. Like thinking about the kinds of ads that people felt were appropriate for something that was watched by 136 million screens with a lot of families behind them. Uh, it's surprising the things that are viewed as important consumption items or important ways of making sense of the world that are being pushed right now um, when you're doing something like watching live TV. It was remarkable. I
Making sense of the world, I think, is such a key piece to that because it's fascinating how much of how we understand the world comes through media like TV, television, the advertisements. Because I mean, it really, I think a lot to where I grew up, I grew up around a lot of people who came from similar backgrounds or cultures to me. And so when I wanted to understand what it meant to be American, for example, I really did turn to the TV screen and I was like, oh, okay, I watched Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. This is what it means to be American. And it's like you learn so much by kind of modeling the behaviors, the things that they care about, what they talk about. And that's how you create some sort of sense of understanding. And so I feel like to watch what gets presented for 3 hours when you know that many eyes are watching always says something really profound about what the current temperature or climate is of being American, right?
When you put it that way, and I think about the Super Bowl, uh, just want to say, I'm from the land of the Green Bay Packers, the only community-owned football team in the country. As soon as they realized what it would look like for communities to own football teams, they banned it. So the football teams that we watched are owned by two extraordinarily wealthy families, coming together to play a sport that we now know does long-term damage to many of the players, with no, significant changes to the rules to try to protect people a little bit more, followed by messages about how we should just turn over really important aspects of our decision making and lives to AI, followed by ads about getting involved in different cryptocurrencies, followed by what I thought was a really remarkable effort to have people learn about the imperial history of the US and the ongoing issues that so many people in the US face um, with being marginalized in various ways. This beautiful call out to thinking about, in this case, Puerto Rico differently and with incredible joy and centering family values intergenerational family values, and then a return to the exact same again. It was like, wow, there's a bit of whiplash going on here. But I'm glad it was at least whiplash. I'm glad there were moments to, I think, make a lot of people step back and say, what are we doing here? And why are we doing it? And so maybe that's good because I actually think one of the things you said that really interested me, I grew up in a time when there were very, very few options for TV, for watching TV for most families, certainly for my family. And so if you watch TV at all, you probably watch the same shows as a lot of people across the country. And that is not the case anymore, right? Like now people are growing up watching completely different sets of ideas being shown on TV. And so this is a moment that I think is actually also a little bit unique right now where a lot of people are watching the same thing. And maybe that shines a kind of different light on what we're being told.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I like the way you kind of laid out what that experience was like because honestly, I feel I was telling you a little bit earlier, and I was thinking about how to kind of connect the two because I've been in a particular period now reading this book, The Dispossessed by Ursula Guin. It's just been so nice because I think sometimes when you're part of a country or a system or a way of thinking, it can be so hard to really break out of that and to imagine what else it could be. And I think there's nothing that does that better than sci-fi, where you're able to kind of walk into another universe where things are so different from the most core foundations of how they think about others, how they think about their own lives. And so this book has been really making me think about, what are the core beliefs that I've taken on living in this country? And so much of it seems to be deeply tied to certain capitalist forms of thoughts. And I think one of the downsides in some ways of my education in relation to learning about capitalism is that when I was young, it was viewed as this just, it's a perfect thing, no critiques, don't even question it, great. And then it kind of flipped on its head in college where it was like, this is the worst thing on the planet. There is nothing worse than it. And obviously, the truth lies somewhere in the middle, where it is a response to certain situations and it fails in a lot of ways. But in a lot of your research and work, when you think about capitalism's uh, influence of education and things, I feel like maybe a great place to even start would be kind of even really thinking about what capitalism is at its at its core. What are some of the core beliefs and ethos that drives what capitalism is?
So I'm actually teaching a class right now that thinks about this a bit. So maybe I'll geek out a little bit and talk about that.
Very
Um,
excited.
so one of the things that I think is really interesting is that over the last couple of decades, there's been such, I think, incredibly powerful efforts to think about what capitalism is. And not, I don't mean this as saying like we need to have one definition that we all agree on. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean that many of us who learned about capitalism in like a classroom setting of some sort probably learned about it as an economic system, um, and an economic system that valued certain things, like competition, for example, and didn't value other things. But we probably just learned about it as a system, right? Like this is a system. This is a way of organizing the economy, for example, and it's you might think about it as the national economy, you might think about it as a global economy at different points in time, but it's that system. And then if you learned a kind of critical response to that, you probably learned a relatively traditional Marxist critical response to capitalist formations, right? And about how people's class positions lead to really different experiences and different relations to capital. And eventually, the people who really are disempowered in that system are going to, rise up and take over the system, and we're going to see radical change. And that hasn't really happened. For anyone who's interested in that particular line of argumentation, there's this incredible book by Tanya Murray Lee, L.I., called Land's End. And it's asking, she's this anthropologist who did research for 25 years in the same places in Indonesia and with these same families. And over the course of the 25 years, the land literally runs out. So long-standing practices of just expanding, expanding out to new land, if and when families needed land, end because these are islands, like land really ends. And what happens? Why is there no revolution, even as certain families have become quite wealthy and other families are unable to support daily life? And how and why does that happen? So I think there's been some really interesting research talking to those, let's call them like kind of older traditional critiques of capitalism. Um, but then you have, feminist Marxists who come in and say we're misunderstanding the whole notion of productivity, for example, and of labor itself, and of production versus reproduction, for example. And then you have people doing, I think, incredible work on ideas like racial capitalism. Like y'all, it's not that any of that doesn't have a place, but you're misunderstanding what has driven the particular global capitalist system that we live in from the start, which is enslavement. And until you understand that and the ways in which the continued racialization of people leads to um, capitalists being able to uh, leech much more out of people than they should be able to, you won't understand why the system works the way it does, right? And then you have scholars talking about settler colonialism and saying that it's not that racial capitalism is wrong, but you're missing the initial need to commit genocide in order to gain land to start this process. Like, what does it do when that dispossession is the start of the story? Or the center of the story. And then you have some newer scholars, often indigenous scholars, saying, not only indigenous scholars, but many indigenous scholars and other sorts of scholars saying that's all right as well. And also, we're finally seeing the consequences of thinking that humans can just pillage whatever they want from the earth around us, and that we don't have to be in good relations with any other sorts of life or non-living entities. And what does that mean about our capacity to survive as a species, much less care for each other? So I love the way that we've been offered, I think, a whole bunch of really, really important tools to think about why the world is organized the way that it is right now, and how when we think with those different tools, we can see different aspects of the system that exists right now, the capitalist system that exists right now. And it can help us think differently as well about what it therefore means to destabilize that system or to transform it towards something more just, more equitable, uh, more relational. So I think that question about what is capitalism is one that we're really doing really good work on right now, but also for which there are many different answers that I think have a lot of depth.
Yeah, I mean, th thanks for even laying all these out because I mean, I think there's what I've been kind of getting stuck on a daily basis. I mean, I think because at the core, really understanding what it seems trivial, but really understanding what money is actually is in itself for me such a complex abstraction. I I don't know why I'm like I can't I need to spend more time really learning about it, but wrapping my head around these markets, understanding what money is. The fact that I mean it's just so fascinating to me. I just tap a little card or I tap my phone and I can buy things. And if I can't tap it and it doesn't accept it, then I can no longer buy it. And when I live in these cities, when I'm spending time in cities, sometimes it's so scary to feel like every single thing that I do depends on me having enough money to go get it done. And the second I run out, everything stops. And it's basically like you can no longer eat, you can no longer find a place to sleep. It becomes absolutely really difficult the second that number on your account goes to zero. And that doesn't just I don't know, for some reason it's so hard for me to wrap around like you spend all this time working so then some number goes into your account and then the account that number is what you use to then go live and to relate with others and then you create entire structures of meaning around it, what it means to own this amount of this number versus that. We've built an entire world around an abstraction, which is so fascinating to me. I mean, And then you just inherit it as if that's like truth or that is. But I feel like recently I've just been realizing I'm like, I don't even understand this abstraction I'm being asked to completely be consumed by.
I think you said a couple of things that are really important for people to think about, and maybe one maybe one that COVID brought into kind of like a different light for some people is that I think part of what at least the US capitalist system does really effectively is what you said. It makes you feel like your ability to survive, certainly your ability to thrive, your ability to have fun, depends on whether you have enough money to do that. Whether it's, physical money, which we don't have so much of anymore, whether it's, as you said, this kind of abstracted flow of resources, give labor, receive something in return, and then use that for consumption of various sorts. And I think one of the things that we were reminded of during COVID, we are reminded of every time there's a natural disaster, we're reminded of when there are human-made disasters, like ice destabilizing communities right now. We are reminded that in the end, what matters is if we are there for each other, if we're in good relationships with the people around us, if when things get really hard for us for whatever reason, we actually have someone who will say, of course, we're going to make sure you're fed. Of course, we're going to make sure you can get a ride to the doctor's appointment that you have to get to. Of course, we're going to make sure that your kid makes it home safe from school. Like that's what we do for each other. And those systems of mutual aid, in the end, those are the systems that determine who makes it when things get really rough. But we strip those systems bare. We put them under attack in the US in ways that I think they're not unique, but they're like, we are incredible at stripping away support for that kind of aid and care for one another, especially over the last 30 years. And there's a lot of data showing the consequences of that from different angles. People feeling like they don't belong anywhere, people feeling like they don't have an organization that they're a part of or that they want to lead, people disconnecting from politics, but not just politics, people disconnecting from all sorts of life-making and sense-making groups, and feeling super isolated because of it. It's super unhealthy for us as human beings, but we are really good at it in this country.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because right before you said that, what I was writing down is I was thinking about this today too. I was just like, I don't want to put this word in a box. I don't really know what it is, but love in some ways feels like the only thing that has been untapped in some ways by this. But I was thinking about it today morning and I was just like, it's fascinating because I think the experience of connection to others has now also been capitalized in such a huge way to where even, I mean, it's just, I'm like, what ex and then dancing. I think there's a few, I think I've always thought about, I'm like, the things that I love or care about most are the things that are found in abundance. I mean, you can always dance. You need somebody to clap their hands and that's all you need to dance, right? Or I think even playing soccer sports in a lot of ways, even just having a ball and being able to throw it back and forth. I mean, there's something so beautiful about these things because at their core, it's just presence of you and another person, minus all these other kind of imposed values and systems that you have to be a part of. But it seems like we're able to, I'm in the Bay right now, and it's intense over here. I mean, the amount of life that seems to be separate from your profession, how rich you are, it's almost non-existent at some point.
I give you a quick I'd love to tell a story for a second about, so I've been really
Please.
lucky over the last decade to get to spend time working with some Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues on thinking about Indigenous education in our School of Education. And as part of that time together over time, I've had the opportunity to spend some time up in Menominee on the reservation. And the the Menominee tribe is one of 11 federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin, and they have an incredible, incredible history. They are world renowned for their forest management. Some of their ancestral lands, because most of their ancestral lands are not under their direct um, care anymore. But they have a reservation in Wisconsin, and you can actually see the Menominee Forest from satellites. It's so different from everything around it. And in the 1950s, 1960s, the federal government wanted the forest reserves, and the tribe said no. And so the federal government basically said, we're not recognizing your tribe anymore. You don't have any of the rights that federally recognized tribes have anymore, in an effort to get them to sell the land off to timber folks. And the tribe refused and fought for decades to reestablish themselves as a federally recognized tribe. And Richard Nixon actually was the president who recognized them again. And they have been they were throughout all that time, but they have been caring for that forest, well, since time immemorial, but particularly since that time, in ways that the rest of the world comes to learn about. Right? Like that is the kind of work that they do. It's incredible. And one of the things that I've learned so much from them about is what it means to care collectively, individually and collectively, with an absolute refusal to um, to shift the values that lie behind that way of caring, right? Just like we are, like, the money that can be gotten from these trees is never what our relationship with the land is about. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, they sell timber, but the ways that they choose to engage with the forest are never primarily about its monetization. And if you spend time in communities, and I've had the incredible luck of being able to do this in Malawi as well. When you spend time in communities where people are working together every second to say those aren't the relations we're centering, those aren't the values we're centering, it's not the way we're living. Over time, it radically transforms the way you see the world. I was going to add to your list the chance to watch a body of water flow, or to watch squirrels playing, is something that when I was growing up, I can tell you I did not appreciate at all. It's like, walk past that, get wherever it is you're going. Why do my parents not let me buy Cabbage Patch dolls? That was what was big when I was young. Or My Little Pony. Um, I have learned to think so differently about the world around me. It's a process I'm still very much trying to deepen, but I have learned so much just by spending time with communities that are not going along with this. And there's a lot of those communities, including in the US, but it can be hard to set aside feeling like that isn't losing something or missing something, slowing down and dancing with people, listening to music together, just sitting and talking, listening to elders share stories, cooking together, things that cost very little, but we commodify all of that, as you said. And I'm going to geek out again for a second. For anyone who's really interested in this, there is an incredible book called The Economization of Life by Michelle.
Ooh, okay.
And it it's one take on this, right? There's a lot of different takes on this, but it's a way of thinking about how so much of the world gets wrapped up into being economized, including relationships, including love, including all these things that I think we know in our soul can't really stay in that register, right? It's really, I think for me, it really helped me understand kind of what it looks like for things to be thought of that way, and what it might look like to move away from that kind of thinking. And she does that around education too. She helped me think about how we economize education and what the consequences are long term for our ability to learn and for our ability to care about what we learn in a really broad way.
I'm just letting this moment sit in because I have so much to respond to this because I think I'm excited to read this also because my best friend, I think one of the things I'm always really fascinated by him is his ability to just watch sunsets and to just without needing to, capture it, without needing to take a photo to tell other people that he saw it, without needing to like use that time as like a recuperation time. Like there's no value to come out of it. He doesn't do it because it's like, oh, after I do this, I'm going to get some creative ideas and then I can work harder. There's no it's just I see the sun setting and that's it. And it seems simple, but my brain cannot understand that. Like I can't do that. I If I'm resting because then I can be more productive. I don't know how to just rest for the experience of rest it's so foreign to me that I am struggling and I'm realizing that's actually one of the huge shortcomings of why I'm not able to simply just be present because my mind's always like, okay, how do I convert this into something, into something, into something that I can't just be? And there are periods of my life where I think I do so much better at it, and I feel like I'm much more grounded, and I'm happy with my life, and I'm more giving, but then there's other moments where and every time I come back to the Bay, I experience that where I lose that entire part of myself, and I feel myself falling into the kind of the machine to, if, in some sense. One thing I really wanted to ask you about is I think the biggest transition for me in terms of education was exactly this. Growing up, I feel like learning so that when I was 6 or 7 years old, learning so that I could one day get a job was just not something that inspired me at all. And I've always loved talking to people and I've always loved learning about people and learning through that. I never was fascinated by, oh, if I do this, then I can get to a good college and then I can, that the marketization of learning itself was so unattractive to me. And as I was telling you earlier, it was when I found math and philosophy and I met so many people who didn't learn for the marketization of their learning. That's when it snapped. And I was like, this is the most fascinating thing. You guys really do this for this. This isn't like the act of doing it is the thing that brings you joy. And that to me changed my entire perception with physics and chemistry and with everything because I was like, there are a lot of people who love this so deeply that they do it for that. But that type of ethos, I think, is so stripped from education. It's I don't even it's not there at all. And I think this season we've been talking to a lot of bureaucrats who kind of have to function because from their perspective, I now also understand why they can't think about this all the time because to to cultivate a system that connects 65 million students to be able to teach them all at the scale that they do, it has to in some ways become a bit more mechanical where you lose the joy, the love, the spark. And so having to contrast these two tensions seems to be at the core of any real education reform. And I'm curious for you, what do you think and how do you kind of, yeah, am I onto something or am I off?
I think we have a lot of really complicated things to weigh in thinking about why school systems look the way they do around the world. Um, and to think about what it would look like to reform them. So the kind of mass schooling systems that I think you're talking about have been radically expanded around the world um, with support from particularly, the US and Europe since the mid 1990s. There was a World Conference on Education for All in 1990 that declared a right to education for everyone. And then through a complex process involving the World Bank and UNESCO, a UN body, that got narrowed to everyone's right to basic education, and it got narrowed even further to like basic schooling for kids, right? Because originally it was a vision of education for all. Like, what would it look like for everyone to have the right um, to education? Let's keep it broadly, right? And that narrowed to like kids schooling. And once it narrowed to kids schooling, and that was because of the World Bank's notion of human capital production and when it's the best investments for governments. It's best investment for governments when people are young, for kids as opposed to adults. The best investment is for girls, but not if they get pregnant, then they've lost it. They're useless. Um, this way of understanding what mattered about education, which is really just schooling, and what mattered was really the rate of return on government investment, not anything that was happening inside of the school, right? Just this black box. Like, you put kids in and out comes higher human capital, and then countries will grow economically. And we got so many more kids around the world in school with that logic. And we got so many more young adults into school in the US with that kind of logic, just at a different level, right? At, secondary and higher education as opposed to primary education in many of the world's lowest income countries. And we have, and then because of our own histories, because of colonial histories, because of the ways we think about how to deal with issues of quality and issues of equality, we've made most school systems around the world very exam centered, right? Which then means that you're focusing kids' learning on trying to pass a high stakes exam of some sort at some time in their lives. And whenever you have exam focused education, schooling, it's pretty narrow and it's usually focused on some version of basically memorization, right? Of like knowing exactly what you're supposed to say in response to particular kinds of questions on this exam. If you think about that in terms of what it teaches us, that's the kind of system that historically um, very non-democratic systems have wanted. Because it teaches people there's one right answer to each question. And if you get the answer wrong, you're just wrong. You didn't study hard enough, you didn't do your work, it's on you. You're the problem. Either because you're too stupid or you're too lazy. But either way, it's your problem. And that's what we ended up spreading around the world. It's not where the impetus for education for all came from, but it's what we ended up spreading. And it's what we ended up doubling down on here in the US. And when you think about school experiences and you think about what we're teaching kids, I mean, I'll tell you, my kids go to public schools in Madison. There's some of the, better public schools in the entire country. My kids can't pee. They have 3 minutes to get from one class to the other, right? 3 minutes to get from one class to the other. And the shortness of that time is in part because the adults in the school building are scared of what the kids are going to do to each other if they have too much time on their hands. And they're not wrong. We had just this horrifying event of a child, a high schooler with autism who was hospitalized. He was beaten up so badly in the bathroom in my kid's school. So it's not that the adults are wrong, but all of their responses to trying to manage teenagers being together in this tiny little age band in these classes that are often really deadening in terms of what kids are being asked to do. It's the everyone's instinct is to control. Everyone's instinct is to create spaces that are carceral. And as we know, for particularly kids of color, schools often lead quite directly to jail systems in this country. And like that's what schools do in reality. They also, just to be clear, right? They also provide space for kids to connect, often with individual teachers, to connect with people who open their world in all sorts of new ways. to have spaces with their friends that are incredibly meaningful and supportive and caring, to get access to food that they may not have at home. Like there's a lot of great things that schools do too, but when we think about it from a learning aspect, too often our systems are set up to try to manage and control a very narrow idea about what learning should be valued and for what purposes. Towards a job, basically. And that if you look at the history of education, of the ways that humans have educated and socialized each other, that is an incredibly specific form of,
Yeah.
of Prussian schooling spread around the world. We have so many other models to draw on, so many other models. And if we were able to think about how to bring those other models, how to loosen what we have and bring those other models um, into being, collective being for many more students, right? Because you don't only want those models in private schools, these other, what we usually call alternative models. We don't want them only in private schools, only available to people who can afford private schooling around the world. We also, from my perspective, do not want to encourage privatization of schooling, period. And at the same time, we have to figure out how to nurture instead of control. And I think we have so many models to do that, but we have to be willing to take them seriously, and we have to provide the resources, which most public school systems around the world do not come close to having right now. We have to provide the resources for schools to really do that, to meet kids where they are and nourish their joy, nourish their sense of wonder, nourish their creativity, and what it is that they want to do as they develop as, little humans and then bigger humans. And all of that, of course, is in community, all of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's coming up for me, especially with how the kind of later half of your response there, is I think a lot of this way about college applications as well, where to understand the whole better, there seems to be this like opening of, a portfolio style. Let me understand who you are. And from the outside, that seems like a great thing. But in my perspective, what I feel like all of that does is it ends up just making your entire being something that can now be measured and judged rather than before where it was just your grades. Now it's your hobbies. Now it's your artwork. Now it's your writing. Now it's every single thing that you do now can now be measured and judged, which means when I talk to a lot of students nowadays, there is nothing that they do for themselves. Everything that they do now, from the second they wake up to fall asleep, is somehow connected to their college application. So, in the attempt of being like, we want to understand you better, they've lost the ability to actually do something for the sake of itself. I think, in the same way, when we think about schooling as a whole, when we say we want to develop, let's say, more well-rounded people, to me, as long as the goal of doing that is just so you can be a better employee, I think it actually will never achieve that goal. So if I'm like, I want, I want the students to develop more critical thinking or something. Let's say, and they want to be justice oriented, and let's just put a bunch of like words or values that might have some that we might want. But so long as that's only done so that, okay, they can come, then they will return back more. It feels like the goal itself is not to actually raise people who lead full lives in some ways. And I think no matter how we approach it, as long as the end goal is for you to be a highly functioning, I guess, productive person in a market and not as a human, then no matter what attempts you make, you will never actually really get there. I don't know, you know?
I don't disagree. And I think that's why I think we have to fight for public schools at every level. And I certainly include the university, my own university and all universities in this. We have to fight to have those other kinds of educational experiences available. So, you said in the beginning, something that made me think. You said science fiction opens up ways of thinking that you find really not easily available in other ways, and I agree with you 100%. I've been a science fiction and fantasy reader since I was very, very young, but I was also really lucky that I grew up partly in Honduras and Guatemala, And as soon as I graduated from college, I had this incredible opportunity to go work in Malawi. And the years that I spent living in other places, not short term, not as a like tourist for a little bit of time, but the years that I spent living in other places for me is can have the similar a similar impact on people, right? Like the chance to recognize that the place that you were born and maybe raised, I moved around a lot when I was young, so I didn't have a place that was like my place to be born and raised. But the opportunity to spend serious time building friendships and going to really different kinds of schools and eating very different kinds of foods and celebrating very different kinds of things in people's lives and in the environment and so forth. That um, that changed radically who I am. And higher education has recognized that, some high schools as well, has recognized that in the study abroad experience, right? But one of the things that's happened with study abroad over time is that it used to be that people who did study abroad tended to do like really long, like a year somewhere else. And then it's gotten shorter and shorter. So then it became like a semester abroad, and now it's often just a couple of weeks abroad. And what you can do, what you can learn when you let yourself be in a different place trying to learn changes radically if you do it only in a couple of weeks. The same with experiential education courses. So we developed a class with this incredible colleague called Learning from the Land. And Dan Cornelius is one of the Oneida seed keepers from here, and he spends a semester with first year students. It's a freshman interest group class, 3 hours every week out on the land learning about Dejope, which is the Ho-Chunk name for Madison. And the students who take that class, their notion of what education looks and feels like, their notion of who they can
Mm,
learn from, like learning from the land and not from, a person at the front of the classroom, their notion of what you can learn is completely different than students who've never had an opportunity like that. But those classes are hard. They're time intensive. They require additional resources. They have to be actively supported, and we don't do that well right now. I want to show you really quickly if I can. This is one of the things that students in that class learn to do. They learn to braid corn. They learned why corn braiding matters. So they learned why you braid corn in order to have corn throughout the year. But they also learned a tremendous amount about corn itself. And they learned a tremendous amount about the patterns, the ways that corn is braided by different folks in different places and why. That kind of learning, I mean, if you think about it, it can go in all sorts of directions. You might be an agroeconomist, you might be interested in botany, you might be interested in um, culinary traditions. There's all sorts of reasons that you might end up like finding this linked to other things you do. But how often do we have the chance in colleges to learn something like that, or in high schools to learn something like that, unless you're in one of these quote unquote alternative spaces? So I really do believe that I believe in nudging open spaces. I believe that radical transformation can take the form that water takes, like slowly learning to flow around and reshape things. And I
mm,
think I think that to my mind right now at this point in my life has real promise. Like I'd like to do large scale transformation. I believe that it's important and necessary. But I think that it starts very often with people really thinking carefully about what they think can matter and creating experiences with one another that can open up new windows. And I think if we do that enough, if we let that be at the heart of reform, we'll get somewhere really different than where we can get with top-down reform. It's not that we don't need both. We do need both. We definitely need both. But I think we often forget about that other side and we don't nurture it. We don't give people space or resources or we don't recognize it. And that makes it really hard for the people who have been trying to do this for a long time. And I've never been in a single school where there aren't some teachers trying to do this. Never. There's always people trying to do this kind of work, but it's really hard if you're fighting alone.
yeah. I think, and a big reason for that is I think when you're working in a school or an actual community, you can see the joy that comes. You can value it because you don't need a number for it. You can simply just see it. And I think, and that's all that you need when someone feels happy to wake. I mean, to me, if you're able to wake up and feel excited for the day, like that's a great day lived. No matter what you're
Yeah.
doing, it's like you've won already the game of life. And I feel like in a lot of ways one of the challenges, and this connects back to capitalism, is that I think at the core, I don't know, understand it that well, so might be saying something wrong here, but it feels like from my perspective, the core or the ethos of capitalism is that it values this kind of how much are you able to produce, how much that's like the highest value. And so if that's the case, then the actual joy of a person is only a means to an end. And so because I was writing down as you were talking earlier, like why would a country choose to value education if it doesn't bring back a return that's larger than the investment that they made? But that is only true in a one way of thinking. Like if the return doesn't have to necessarily only be financial, the return could also just be a society of really happy people. And that may not necessarily have to mean you're able to produce more. But that doesn't, one, I don't really think we have metrics that measure that to even check, if we really cared about it, I don't even know if we have something to measure like what is the well-being of our country. And I think if we had some measurement of that, maybe we could value that as much as we value GDP, for example, right?
So Bhutan actually has something called the Gross Happiness Index,
Yeah, I've heard of that.
right?
Yeah.
And that is exactly what Bhutan said. Like that's not actually what we're going to value. We're not going to measure our success, our happiness, our well-being in terms of simple, financial measures. And um I don't know, I don't really know anything about Bhutan, so let me start by saying that. But there's I've read some really, really interesting work about the way that Bhutan is building new cities to align with this notion of kind of a happiness index. And part of what they're doing, again, this is just my understanding from very limited knowledge, um, is thinking carefully about what brings people together instead of keeping people apart. So, architecturally, for example, what brings people together instead of keeping them apart, and what is in balance with the earth. Because in the end, I I really do believe whatever you think of capitalism, and we can think of it from the perspective of those who are kind of supportive of capitalism and those who are critical of capitalism. But in either case, I think there's very few people who are empiricists who would argue that we're not in an increasingly terrifying place for our species. Like capitalism requires using natural resources in ways that have proven themselves in the ways that we have practiced capitalism to be absolutely unsustainable. We're feeling the impacts of that all the time. And I do believe that our animal bodies know that. I do believe that we know that. And we can respond to that in a number of different ways. But we know that a lot of people who live in the US respond to it with really intense, either ignoring it or really intense fear. And the fear tends to lead to people feeling like they have to grab more because it's them. Either they have it or someone else has it. And however much you have, it's never enough because you can always
Damn.
rise and you can always fall in capitalist systems, right? It's one of the core notions. Equity is not desired, right? You're always creating inequalities in capitalist systems.
Damn.
That's what competition is meant to do. And so if you're always competing, it means you never have enough. Like you could always compete more. You could always get a little bit more of the pie. And when our animal bodies know things are out of whack, things are running out, things are not working well, a lot of us grab more. And I think we have communities and we have individuals who have shared their knowledge with us about how to embrace this moment differently. And so it's not that there are ways we can educate ourselves about other approaches. There are ways we can call ourselves when we feel ourselves doing that. And I think that that could be something that's really powerful. If we think about education, not just schooling, but if we think about education, that's another way that we might be able to get into this, right? To get people to think about what we need to be doing with each other and in relation to our co-species in order to survive this moment. And it's all about mutual aid. It is not about hoarding, right? Like the most wealthy people in this world right now are hoarders. They are hoarding, for example, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars as if they can never have enough wealth. It's, I mean, when a person with less money does that, they're diagnosed as having a disorder. But capitalism valorizes that, especially capitalism at this phase, valorizes that. And so it's easy for us to valorize it too. But I think we can educate ourselves differently. And it may not be able to happen top down, right? Like it may have to happen bottom up, as so many real educational reforms have been.
Damn. So this is amazing, by the way. Thank you. I mean, I just in general, I mean, I feel I I go through these kind of phases where usually I'm a really optimistic person. I usually, you caught me on one day where haven't been feeling that way, but almost every other day I really do hold a lot of optimism in my heart as I move through my day to day. And so I feel like this kind of piece that you touched on at the end, which is something I really do try to cultivate in the different things that I create but how does, from what you've seen, how does ground up change happen? So it starts at maybe one teacher, maybe, and then it spreads to a school. And how does that, what have you seen? How does that work?
So I spent a lot of time, a lot of decades now, working with a group of colleagues in Malawi who have taught me uh, what community mobilization can look like. And let me start by saying it's not easy. It's not there's not some like ideal, beautiful, perfectly functioning community and you just, give them what they need and everything goes well. Communities are really complex. They are laden with power differences. And to be able to work with communities towards change, you have to, or to be able to work with your own community or other communities towards change, you have to be able to really analyze those power relations with open eyes and figure out what aspects of those dynamics have to be managed and addressed in order to achieve just change, whatever just change looks like and means to the community and to larger groups that they're part of. But from my experience, it is really helpful to have someone in a community who cares passionately about whatever issue it is that you're trying to create transformation around, right? And obviously, you want to be aligned with with their feelings about the transformation. Um, it's really helpful, but an individual working alone will not get very far at all, right? So an individual who has vision, who has care, who really wants passionately to create change is going to have certain strengths and they're going to have certain weaknesses. And they're also just going to have the constraints of their own time and energy and everything else that they have to do with their life on top of, whatever the mission is. Let's say the mission is improving schools. Let's just say that's it, right? So you have to figure out how the individual becomes a community, right? A community of people dedicated to the particular kind of transformation that is envisioned. And then you have to figure out how the community's efforts to transform fit in with broader political and economic and social structures and systems, some of which are probably going to work actively against that vision of transformation, right? So what does it mean to figure out how to lower some of those barriers. And in some cases, it's not barriers. Like in some cases, people face very serious dangers in trying to reform something, right? So it's really important to understand how any community's efforts fit within these broader systems and structures, some of which may align with their vision and many of which probably won't, especially when you're working with communities, as I have mostly done in the past, that are marginalized geographically, economically, politically, socially, linguistically, religiously, whatever it might be. But communities that are marginalized in the structure are much more likely to face efforts to stop um, reform instead of starting them. If I might just give a very short plug, I don't know how many of the folks who are listening to this podcast may be aware of the Black Panther Party's work in creating a free breakfast program, um, which was just an incredibly powerful program that had a radically positive impact, not only on individual kids and their well-being, but on communities, on knitting together people across um, racial and class and sometimes geographic lines. And our government worked really hard to dismantle that effort and make sure that it wouldn't serve as an alternative vision for thinking about caring for each other and our kids. So there's a lot of power organized around what I consider socially just and positive change often. And so, in order to really create an opportunity for change and transformation, not only to occur, but if possible, to be sustained over time and maybe even to spread to neighboring communities, you have to take into account the realities of those systems and pressures that are going to be brought to bear. You have to find the resources that are needed because there's always some resources needed, even if they're, not too many, but there's always going to be resources needed. And you have to figure out how people um, knit together even when things get really hard and what it takes to give people breaks. Adrienne Marie Brown has some really beautiful work on how radical it can be to just say, I have to rest. And I'm not resting in order to recharge for the next productive moment. I'm resting. I'm not going to be part of this system. I'm not going to be part of taking these kinds of actions. I'm not going to do it. I don't want to be naive. I've worked in a lot of communities in which food security is a really, 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 really serious concern. And in which, for example, people don't have access to, for example, basic antibiotics if their kid gets sick. We can't pretend that we don't have to deal with those practicalities and realities alongside any sort of social transformation. Like people need the basics of survival in place, and people need the basics of care in place to the extent that those exist in this world. So I think creating change requires bringing all of that together, right? It requires these really careful analyses of how to help people work together, even in systems that are actively trying to stop that work, and that also acknowledge people's fragility, right? Our need for food and shelter and care, basic medicines. Those things also have to be in place. And sometimes there's tensions there, right? So, like, sometimes people have to hold jobs that take a lot of their time and energy, and that actively work against what they're trying to accomplish in this other space. But they have to. They also have to have their family fed. And so, those are, I think, some of the things that we sometimes get wrapped up in. I grew up in a period of time, at least, where I thought I either had to be like 100% all the time, the person that I imagined myself to be doing the exact kind of change work that I wanted to do. Um, it's very hard for that to be the case for most people. There are some people who can do that, but most people have a lot of other connections and responsibilities that they're trying to balance and manage. So one of the things that I really appreciate about a lot of the movements that I've been a part of more recently, like reform movements, is that there's a really strong focus on acknowledging that different people really have different kinds of resources. They're positioned differently in relation to systems of power, and people's roles are therefore going to need to be different. Not everyone's movement towards the reform should look the same or can be the same. And so, like, recognizing, doing the work to figure out what roles you can play, how you can play an important role in what has to be a larger movement, but recognize that there's not one way of doing it right. We have to be able to stand with each other even when people are doing things that we don't think are maybe quite as important or quite as useful or quite as, necessary. We got to have space for people to be able to participate in different ways. Um, there's a colleague of mine who taught me a great deal, who writes about this, named Michael Apple. And I love the way that he says, what roles are you going to play in these different movements, depending on who you are and how much time and energy and other resources you have available. That's really helped me think about both recognizing what I need to be doing and what I may not be able to do, and also recognizing what others may or may not be able to do, and that we need to figure out ways to be in solidarity with each other that don't require that everything looks the same for everyone.
Hmm. Damn. That was really, thanks. I mean, that was really beautiful. And I feel like something I'm really thinking about as we start to maybe wrap this up is I want to understand, what do you think it is within us that yearn for change at all? Like I find that to be so fascinating because it's always been something that's just been deeply embedded in me. It's not something I woke up one day and was like, I want to care about this. Like it's just I just it was something in me from when I was really young. I mean, I always deeply disliked how my experience in school was, and I never wanted it to be the same. But it wasn't like some rational, it wasn't like I was like, oh, because I don't like this, I want to really care about it. The care just naturally came. And I sometimes wonder, because the thing that makes me really afraid is I think some of the most terrible people in human history, quote unquote, terrible, have also had a deep desire for change as well. And I think change is not something that's just intrinsically a great thing. And so to constantly be aware of what is the part of me that wants to create change, and how do I know that that part is not the same as what drove those really terrible people in human history as well? I mean, how do you sit with that tension?
I think it's a really, really good question. And I think it's, I'm not trying to, bullshit my way out of this. I think it is righteous to say that people are going to respond to that question in really different ways. I have had the opportunity to spend time with families and communities where I think they would argue, there's a very famous song called Cambia Todo Cambia. Everything changes. Like, and lots of people over time with, giving great quotes about how the only thing that is stable is that there's always change. Those kinds of quotes, right? But I've spent time with individuals and families and communities who I think recognize that change and recognize uh, that there is constant, we're always in flux, we're always in motion, but they see that change in ways that are, for example, more cyclical. They see those changes in ways that aren't linear, and they think about what it is that they think it means to be in right relations in this world. And maybe that doesn't change, but because other things are changing all the time, your response to various individuals or institutions or uh, practices or whatever it might be, maybe your response to those things has to change because you're interacting with certain kinds of changes. But maybe the core of what we're trying to do together doesn't. And then I think there are people who want change because they want revolution. They want change. They want change to take a new direction. Um, they want something to look radically different than it does right now, but it's not necessarily based on an understanding of the history of the now. And I think um, that second kind of change is much more likely to lead to unintended consequences. Let's be honest, sometimes people want change because they want to make the world a worse place for most other people, right? Like that is true. That's true throughout history. Whether it's just out of pure selfishness or whether it's out of what I might consider a certain kind of evil, But there are people like that. And I think when people like that gain power, if we don't collectively respond, their vision of the world comes more into being. And I think we have a responsibility to fight against that. But I think there's a lot of other people who just, they things aren't good. They have to change. They have to change. Not non-reflective desire to just change, short-term thinking about desires to change. Those line up really well with particular kinds of capitalist systems, particular kinds of injustices, particular ways that they can be co-opted in the current system that we live in. That I think we have responsibility because I do that a lot. I'm like, this has got to change. It's just got we got to go. Like this is not okay. I think this is what we should do. For me, because of my own history, the way that I try to stop that and think really carefully about what I mean by change, how I think change is accomplished, is recognizing that my experience is singular, although it also reflects similar experiences that others may have had who are moving through the same spaces that I am with some of the same characteristics in their life. Um, and I better stop and I better think about what I want change for, who I want change for, and whether whatever it is that I'm thinking about the change that I'm imagining is actually primarily stopping, learning what it is that the people who I want to make this change with actually think and actually want, and then figuring out how I can be of service to that vision. That doesn't mean that I don't have the right to have a vision of change as well, but it does mean that I, as an individual, have, one very particular way of understanding a problem or a potential solution or a way that I want to be in the world or the relationships that I think are righteous or the things that I think are happening. Like I'm wrong sometimes about what's actually happening. I better stop. I better start being in community about this. I better start learning from others and thinking with others and working with others. And if I do that, I think I am much less likely to do things in a manner that actually have really deeply negative unintended consequences. I'll just note as an aside that a lot of my research is looking at the unintended consequences of people's honest efforts to make the world a better place. But when you do it from the top down, when you do it without recognizing sociocultural practices and the political economies in which people live, when you do it mindlessly and thoughtlessly, assuming that your experience is other people's experiences, you harm people. And it is unintended. In most cases that I've seen, it is deeply unintended. But that's really, for me, that's where my learning is coming from. Watching people who are trying to do good, but the way they go about it, they harm.
I mean, and then there's so much to get into what you've seen, how that works, because I think that is, I think, where it can sometimes be really easy to point at someone or some institution or a government and just be like, they're bad. That's why this is the case. But I think one of the main things I've learned through all these conversations is exactly what you just said, which is so often people are trying, but there seems to just always be these unintended consequences, even with good intention sometimes. And I think when we forget that, we can sometimes it becomes much simpler to be like bad consequences only happen because of bad intentions, and that's just not, I think, how oftentimes things work. And it and that's why change and thinking about these larger things can be so complicated because and maybe that's why humans maybe weren't meant to think about scales of 400 million people because it seems impossible. And so then you turn to numbers and you turn to things that you can understand. But my brain can't imagine what 400 million people means, like or whatever 350 or whatever the population of the US is. It can't do that. And I've driven across the country 4 times, and that gave me a tiny bit of understanding of what it's like to live in these tiny towns all over the country and how different Nebraska is from Wyoming, from Idaho. But it's too big with too many people with too many different lived experiences and perspectives that perhaps top down is just not what we were meant to do in some ways. And maybe the best change you can make is with the people around you, with your local community, because that feels so much more real. It feels like you have much more of a chance. And I think there's a lot of hope to be found at that scale, where thinking about doing it for at the scale of the entire country or even the entire world seems that can be very overwhelming, I feel.
I think that's a really valid point. I think we have a lot of data to indicate that, let's call them bottom up, just for the sake of using a term that's often used. Bottom up or participatory approaches to change. I think we have a lot of evidence that they're often much more successful at achieving whatever the outcome is that is desired, right? And there's often this concern that they're not scalable or they're not necessarily sustainable in particular like measurable ways. And so because of that, they're not worthwhile. But the notion of scaling, the notion like that size is better, that bigger is better, that faster is better, those are really deeply capitalist notions. So that idea that somehow like a small
Hmm.
workers' co-op that has changed families' lives for 20 years is meaningless because we can't do it everywhere. That, like, we know for people in the workers' co-op, that's not true. We also know it's not true for the people who happen to get lucky enough to learn about that co-op and think about whether they might be able to use ideas that that co-op has developed to do something different wherever they are, right? Like, so our ideas, I think, about scalability and about sustainability, like the continuation of something over time, I think have been really warped. This is an area where I think if we check ourselves and we check the kind of capitalist logics that might be working, it can be really, really helpful. I can give a quick example of um,
Please.
so there was this incredibly successful project run by a church in northern Malawi with U.S. Agency for International Development money. And it was a project about 20% of kids in Malawi have been orphaned. Most of them, but certainly not all of them, by AIDS.
Wow.
And a lot of those kids live with their grandmothers, grandparents, but it's usually grandmothers. And grandmother-headed households, as they're called in the literature, tend to be, along with some child-headed households, tend to be the most marginalized households in communities, as you would imagine, right? And the logic is that the grandmother or the child who heads the household is not productive. They're not in their productive years. And then they have little kids they're taking care of who are also not in their productive years. And so, in a country like Malawi, where most people still survive at least part of the year through agriculture, when you don't have agricultural labor for the households are really, really, really poor, right? They're really food insecure. People are really struggling to make ends meet. And so, this USAID project gave grandmother-headed households a package. It had like oil and salt and maize flour, which is the base of the food that people eat regularly. It had a couple of other things in it. It had a base package of food for these grandmother-headed households. And they measured the impact of just having these base packets of food, and they did not cost very much at all. Just having this base level of food security, these base packets, changed really significantly the nutritional status of the kids in the household. It changed how often those kids went to school because they didn't have to go out looking for food, looking for, daily wage labor to try to bring food into the house. But it also changed other measures of the kids, their sense of security, for example. And one of the things that when you do good research on grandmother-headed households, a lot of kids living in grandmother-headed households feel very, very deeply loved and protected by their grandmothers. So there's a lot you can build on there if you let the grandmothers be relieved enough of the pressure of trying to figure out how they're going to feed everyone so that they can really spend more time with kids doing other things, including transmitting the incredible knowledge, the wisdom that they have from the years that they have lived and farmed and been in social relations and all that great stuff. So, by almost any measure you can imagine, this was a huge success. Huge success. But USAID canceled it after 5 years. Now, there's a lot of reasons that these development projects usually end after 5 years. But one of the reasons given was that the project had proven unsustainable because the grandmother-headed households were not able at the end of this time to take over sourcing food for the families, maintaining these
Mm,
packages, and the communities didn't take it over either. So I think that it certainly, from my perspective, is incredibly short-sighted, but it also borders on a particular form of evil to say that these households, because at the end of the 5 years, the grandmothers are 5 years older, right? To say that these households are supposed to somehow figure out in these incredibly resource-constrained environments how to continue a project, that that's a measure of success, as opposed to saying grandmothers of this kind deserve all of our collective support. What have we not done to guarantee that this kind of support continues, right? We being both USAID and the government and the community and, right? Lots of different people here at play who could help to support these households. And to recognize the incredible assets, I hate calling it that, but we'll call it that, funds of knowledge, assets that these grandmothers have, right? And what they can bring to the community if they're just given the space to be valorized and acknowledged. So USAID canceled the project. The kids who had 5 years of food support, their lives are forever changed. Those households who had 5 years of time when they didn't have to be focused only on food security, when they were able to be there with each other, learning with each other in ways that may not have been possible afterwards, right? To think that that is not an important, even maybe sustainable outcome says something about the kinds of logics we're using to think about what matters to human beings together in a particular time and a particular place. Our notions of sustainability and scalability, for example, I think are really off, and I think they damage the ways we can think about transformation and about change and about reform. And so that to my mind is an example of how we need to be able to think differently about what it is we're trying to accomplish together and how we're going to understand the success of that.
I'm writing I mean, thanks for these stories. I feel like the stories make them feel so much more rich, and I feel so much closer to the messages that you're saying rather than just abstracting it intellectually. I mean, there must be so many stories, but if you in the next few months have some more time, I'd really love to have you back on. This has been such an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Gautam. I've enjoyed it so much. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it. And yeah,
Well,
anytime,
yeah.
let me know when.
Of course. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I mean, this really was a really powerful conversation. I've written so many notes. I didn't even know I could do that, but I'm excited to listen back to this. I hope you guys enjoyed as well. If you've been interested in the show, you can find us on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple. And if you have enjoyed, you can also support us on Patreon. But I hope you're having a great week. And as per usual, stay re-educated.